Cool. So thank you everyone for coming. We're going to be talking about GDPR as it relates to you, not as it relates to the privacy industry necessarily. So what I really want from you all is to get involved today. I know some of you might already be thinking, I want to get out of here as soon as possible. Yeah, I appreciate it's a nice air-conditioned room, but what I really do want from you is to get involved. So please, there probably won't be time for questions at the end. So please ask me questions all the way through. Right now, whenever you've got one, dive in. We chose this room on purpose because it's small and intimate, and hopefully you feel that you can interact with each other. My opinion is just as valid as all of your opinions, to a lesser degree. Seriously, I want you all to get involved because your insights are what we're all here for. I would also like to thank 3 people that have given me some inspiration for this talk on there. Please check them out on Twitter and some of their websites. They've given me some feedback on some of the kind of things that you all might want to hear. So, what I do, I work as a data protection officer for lots of different companies. 4 of them are on screen there. And my job is the opposite of a PR person. So I keep people out of the press, ideally. The last thing I want is my CEO to end up in a position like this, even if they are running for president, or especially if they're running for president, or even whether it be from a criminal perspective, or even whether it's just in front of a lot of old people asking what the internet is. So GDPR is this kind of thing that probably you've all had this kind of face on of, oh my God, what's going on? Lots of people have managed to get to a good place with GDPR, but, what really is it? You're probably sick of it, and it's been a busy time, probably for all of you. You've probably all seen an uptick, an increase in work related to security, privacy, project management, change control, this kind of stuff. And as a data protection officer, I've been very heavily involved in that. I try to have a bit of fun with it. Occasionally that bit of fun backfires when you put things like this on LinkedIn and people think it's serious and start asking you some very kind of sharp questions, and you have to explain to them like, sorry, yeah, it's just a wind up. Now, in parallel to the GDPR, we also have this thing called the Data Protection Act. Now, that hasn't gone away. That's been replaced by a new one called the Data Protection Act 2018. So catchy. So what it all means is that for all of you, you have to comply with both the GDPR and the UK Data Protection Act 2018. Now, the Data Protection Act basically says, follow the GDPR, and here's some extra little bits we've thrown in because we're British and we can do that. And one of those, for instance, is the age of digital consent in the UK. We've set that at 13. Ireland actually set it at 13 and then quickly changed their mind to 16. And if you look across Europe, that age of consent is different. So I believe Germany is 16, some are 15, others 13. Now this makes it problematic if you've got a business such as those I work in where you are working across Europe, across the world, and trying to build in age consent systems. So you have to think about, how do I determine what country you're in? Is it your citizenship? Is it your GeoIP? Is it where you registered? What if you're on holiday for a week? These are kind of like interesting things to think about, so not very easy. So one of the things that you all should be very, very aware of, is this thing called the registration in the ICO in the UK. Now, historically, this is a thing across Europe that local regulators said, if you're handling personal data, you've got to register with us and let us know. If you've got CCTV cameras, you've got to let us know. The GDPR came along and got rid of that registration requirement. Great. And then the UK said, but we need money to fund us, so we'd kind of like to keep it. So that's why we've still got this in the UK, even though the GDPR kind of says that we're getting rid of it. Now, what it all means to you all is if you process personal data, whether you've got a company or you're professional any kind of way, or you've got CCTV on your house and you're looking at, let's say, the path in front of you or the road, you've got to register and pay your £40. It's a legal requirement. And there was a case in the last few days where an organisation that had CCTV hadn't registered and didn't really comply with the ICO, and as you can see on there, they've just been fined quite heavily for that. It went to court.
Does that change? So if a person will use CCTV, as long as it's used for your domestic property, they change the rules to say you don't need to register as a data protection officer, you don't need to do anything under?
Yeah, so the question there was essentially what do you have to do with CCTV and registering of personal data? And the simple thing to say there is there's guidance created by the ICO specifically on CCTV. So go and have a look at that. But generally, if you're having CCTV that's outside of your own domain that might capture anyone else, potentially even a post person or milkman or whatever, you might just want to do it. So it's just for good practice. So have a look for that guidance.
So if you get a Ring doorbell, you have to register for CCTV, right?
Quite possibly Ring doorbells, Nest doorbells, and any kind of smart stuff. So just be very aware as you're getting more smart and able to about these kind of things. So the ICO registration is an annual thing. So, for instance, like individually, you might be paying £40 every single year. Now, all this kind of data protection stuff, Data Protection Act, GDPR, it all comes really down to these kind of 6 principles of what you do. So people say, well, what is the GDPR? It's kind of that. So looking through it is things like, be fair with people's data. Don't keep it longer than you need it. Have security. Now, the big question probably for you all is, how secure does it need to be? And the great answer is, it just needs to be appropriately secure. And what's that? So, now
better than somebody else's.
Well, yeah. Now, this is a really, really interesting point about how compliant should we be with a compliance regime like GDPR. And my answer to you is, you'll never be 100% compliant because no one ever can be. It's like you can never be the perfect driver at all times. But it's not about being the best. It's not about being faster than the bear. It's about being faster than the person next to you. Let the bear get them. So the appropriate security thing is a bit of a vague one. And the reason the GDPR is so vague is it's a regulation that's got to last about 20 years. Now imagine trying to write a set of rules for the internet that's going to last 20 years. It's not very easy. It's quite vague. Now, fortunately, the NCSC has just written a guide on what they think appropriate security is. And that's very helpful. But unfortunately, it really just says, do some risk assessments and work out what is appropriate for you. Now, whilst that sounds a bit weak, ultimately, what is appropriate for Google is different to someone that cleans windows. You know, what security do they need? Might cost £5, Google maybe 5 billion. So it's all about what you truly need. Now, personal data is at the heart of all this. It's personal data. It relates to people, not corporate data, let's say some financial stuff. If it involves personal elements to it, it's in scope. Now, this is the ICO in the UK's new campaign, this Privacy Matters campaign. You'll see a lot of these yellow things going on and a lot of press around this. Now, personal data is anything that helps identify an individual. So that could be an IP address. It could be a tattoo. It could be a height. It could be a clothing style. It could be a lot of things, so bear that in mind. Now, the scope of this regulation is the EU and also the EEA. So EU in blue, EEA in green. So Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. Bang in the middle there. So, and how that works is not about citizenship. If you see anything that says EU citizens, it is wrong. It's often used as shorthand, but it really is. If you're in that location, then you're protected by the GDPR. And what that means is, if you are, let's say, an Australian company processing a lot of data, and you process data about me, let's say Qantas Airlines, let's say they had an office just in Sydney, and they wanted to try and sell stuff to me, by having a website that sells in pounds, or is translated in French, they are knowingly targeting European people, and therefore they have to comply. And that's how the kind of international aspect of it works. Now, next slide is a really key one for you all. I've anonymized this person here, so you won't be able to tell who, you won't be able to tell that's Robin at all. So these 3 terms, please just bake them into your memory. So we are data subjects. We are in Europe. We are living people. We have data on us. Grab a seat, mate. It's fine. I'll start again. And so as individual data subjects, we have data that gets looked after by data controllers. So we give our data to a company, let's say it's Amazon.co.uk or a university. Data controllers look after it. Now, as a data subject, if I want to exercise my rights to say I want to check what you're doing with it, delete it, access it, all that kind of stuff, you speak to a data controller. You never talk to a data processor. Data processors are the back-end service providers that talk with the controllers. So any service provider is a data processor, essentially. They might also be a controller, but generally it's that kind of relationship going on. So if you think about the Amazon.co.uk example, they're a controller in the middle, and they're probably using AWS at the back end. So if you wanted to exercise your data rights, you wouldn't talk to AWS, you'd talk to the people you're giving your access, your data to. So these rights we all have, there's plenty of these rights, and there's some simple examples. So one of the new ones is the data portability. So portability is all about, you might get that, it's all about the ability to ask for your data back and use it elsewhere, so moving between banks. Rectification, it's probably not that, but yeah, it's all about being able to get your data changed how it should be. So if someone's misrepresented you online in some kind of unfair way about your personal data, they have to get it changed in a short space of time. And the one that a lot of people ask about is erasure as well. Now, again, erasure is all about just making sure you can ask for your data to be erased. Often people will say no, for good reasons and bad. So we can talk about that more in detail. But the biggest one that everyone misunderstands about data protection law is this. This article of the GDPR, this section of the GDPR spells out you have 6 ways legally you can process data. Now, the first word I want you to really focus on is lawful. This regulation is not about saying what you can't do. It's saying you can't process personal data unless you make it lawful by doing one of those. So I can ask for consent from you. I can write a contract with you. I can say, I'm the press, it's in the public interest. You can use one of these 6. Consent is one of the 6. It's not any more powerful or less powerful than the rest. So please, if people say, you published my name on Twitter, I didn't give you consent, you don't need it, because you can argue you have a legitimate interest. Or you might say, you signed up to Twitter and therefore there's a contract between you and Twitter that allows that kind of data sharing. The point is, there's 6 ways any organization, any person globally can use to process data. So please don't get hung up on which is best and which is right. What you'll often find in business is consent is rarely ever used. I mean, think about today that you've all had. You came here, you probably traveled here, you might have been in a hotel, you've probably bought things. At no point did anyone ask you for this kind of consent thing of, do you consent, yes or no? You could have got your right to withdraw it, all that kind of nonsense. It was just, you give me money, I give you things, that's legitimate interest. Come in, guys.
Why do you think people are so vulnerable? There's a lot of stuff where they're saying, by doing this, you consented to. Like, seriously, don't you consent to contact me if I've given you my details to contact?
Yeah, so the question is, why do people get so hung up on consent? It's a big misunderstanding. And there's various reasons. One, it sounds easy. 2, people say things like, they use consent in a kind of lowercase c perspective where they say, inside this contract, do you consent to this? Do you consent to that? Employment contracts you've all got, there might be the word consent in there, which it shouldn't be. There's a lot of confusion and people have never really kind of looked at this. Consent is kind of easy to understand. Yes, you asked me a question. Yeah.
It's very visible. A lot of marketing and PR went with the consent because you have to do something visibly apparent to the user, and the Americans are very against that consent aspect, right? It came out of the marketing suddenly telling you, well, the newspapers suddenly telling American organizations, well, you can't have this opt-out checkbox anymore, you need to have an opt-in checkbox, and it has to be off by default.
So just to go along with that, as well said, there's the other big issue with consent is we have GDPR talking about data protection. We also have the marketing laws, like the e-communication laws, which is a whole separate ballgame. And those talk about if you want to send unsolicited marketing, potentially you might need consent. So the 2 overlap each other and people just go, I think I need consent. It sounds easy. So people just think consent is the easy option, but it just gets very messy when you get detailed into it. But simple thing for you all is when people shout at you, go, you need my consent to do X, Y, and Z. Potentially not. So look into that, look into some scenarios.
It's all very grey, though.
Yeah, massively. And again, we have this issue of it's a regulation that's for 20 years, and it needs to be woolly, but also you need to so deeply understand it to make it simple. And the issue is, like, what is legitimate interest? Now, here's a good example. You walk into Starbucks and the person says, like, what would you like? Right, I'd like a coffee. They write my name on the coffee cup. They ask my name, I give my name, they write it on the coffee cup. At the end of it, I get the right coffee, they've given it to the right person, everyone's kind of happy and I walk away. That's a legitimate interest use of my data right there. It's like nice and fair and balanced. But if I then got a phone call next day from Mr. Starbucks, that's probably not his name, but let's say I did, Mr. Starbucks phones up and says, "Hi Carl, how's the coffee?" I'd be a bit freaked out by that. It's like, how'd you get my details? Well, it was easy. We've got CCTV, we've got your name, reverse Google image search, we found you, found your phone number and called you up. Now they could argue that's a legitimate interest in their perspective to do that and get feedback, but I'd say that you might have an interest, but it's way infringing on my rights for privacy. So on that basis, that balance wouldn't really work there. So that's why, unfortunately, you have to look into each one very deeply, and that's why the role of the data protection officer is growing massively.
But is it fair to say consent is normally used when the interest is more in one party's favour than the other?
Not really, to be honest. Consent is mainly used where you absolutely need it. My advice is never use consent unless you legally have to use it. Now, it sounds a bit crazy, but it's just the way it should be. And people you don't need to use consent. Consent is very problematic. If anyone wants to talk about the nuances of consent in business, we can spend ages on this all through today, apart from the football period. It's coming home, by the way. But this two words I want you to think about as well. Inside GDPR is the two middle words, data protection. What is data protection? Now, a lot of you in here will be security people. So you might think it's all about securing data, and other legal people might think it's nothing to do with security. Well, so let's talk about protection and why it's important. So protection, it is pretty vital, but what I want you to think about is protection has got two sides to it. My favourite is actually that one there. It's just her face. But I want you to think about your data. You want it to be secured, okay, from other people. So that's one side of data protection. But the other side of it is you want to be protected from how your data can be used against you. So if you think about the Facebook example, let's look at those two words there, data breach. Now, many of you will know what happened here, where essentially Facebook had an API that was fairly open back in 2013, like before 2014. They had someone that created a quiz. They took a load of data, and then this person sold the data to Cambridge Analytica. Facebook didn't know about what was going on at all. Now, the question is that a data breach? What do you think? Data breach, not a data breach? No?
Depends on what.
Okay. Yeah.
It would depend on how Facebook is presented that they're using the personal data. And because Facebook's use of personal data is actually quite open, it's probably not a data breach.
Exactly. So you're all saying pretty much not a data breach. Is it a compliance breach? Maybe. But we have this word breach. We have to really start being precise about what things are. Because arguably Facebook, that data was accessed from Facebook completely lawfully by a researcher. He then sold it on. So it's his breach, not Facebook's. But in the press, hey, it's a data breach. So you have to be quite concerned about what the language we really do use and whether it's truly correct or not. A data breach, in my view, is where you have, and the kind of EU's view, ICO's view, is when you have a loss of confidentiality. Your data gets breached and somebody else accesses it that shouldn't do. A compliance breach just says you broke one of the rules of the GDPR. So, great point. So you're talking about an example there of an organisation had a breach of contract, a breach of how they comply with that contract. Yeah, exactly. So what you did there, you precisely used the word breach, and that's what I love to hear, is that we say they breached that contract. It's not a data breach. It's a breach about data, but it's not a data breach. And this is the kind of thing of like security people, data breach, compliance people, compliance breach. So if you can start all using that kind of thing, it'll make it a lot clearer. So privacy is this new word that has always been around. It's a generally new concept in society, but it's becoming very, very important. But we need to start thinking about privacy and security as being very distinct things, and how we can have a privacy breach like Facebook, and privacy is now suddenly becoming very, very important to very important to Facebook. Now, the interesting thing with Facebook is Facebook's business is based on selling data. Okay, we all agree on that. So, fundamentally, they have an existential sort of crisis going on where they say, we all care, we want to give you all control, and we love your data and everything, we're going to look after it. But their business is still based on selling it. So, there's not a lot they can really do. So I kind of feel for Facebook in the sense that they have their business, they have to do the best by their business. So, that's what they're based on. So, let's talk about penalties. Now, if we relate penalties and fines back to all these breaches we've been talking about, what do you get fined for? You get fined for breaching compliance. End of story. You don't get fined for a data breach. A data breach might come from a breach of compliance, but just because you lost a DVD or a load of data, or you had an XSS and someone stole a lot of stuff out of your database, that is not itself finable. That is not something that is problematic. It's the fact you had inappropriate security that led to that. So think of an example. If you get hit by a 0-day that came from a nation state, and you might say, we're not here to defend against nation states at SteelCon. Our website had a vulnerability. China came after us. So sorry about that. We had appropriate security for the threat we were trying to beat. We risk assessed that. That's a good argument. Not when someone like TalkTalk gives their call center at Wipro in India unlimited access to all user data. And so what happened in that instance? The Indian call center workers downloaded all the custom database, gave it to their mates down the road, and started scam phone calling people in the UK. So because of that, TalkTalk got fined £100,000. Technically not for the breach, but for the lack of appropriate security. So that breach of compliance, like number 6 on that list. So appropriate security is what you want to think about. And that is a bit annoying because we all like to think of, SQL injection, that's a breach. Well, it probably is, because most people should have appropriate security defined as not having SQL injection attacks against them. But you might say, it's a personal blog, who cares? There's no data behind it, who cares? So, yeah, just be aware of this kind of balance and interplay. Yeah.
You mentioned an example of attacks with SQL injection. So, as a penetration tester, I'm doing my work.
Yep.
I hacked the website, and it accidentally has custom data in there. I believe it's a test website, but I'll come back with personal identifiable information. Am I now out of compliance with GDPR? Do I need to agree with my data control in my company? What do I do?
Yeah, so question there is essentially you accidentally handle personal data. Yeah. We'll come on to that in a few slides. But please, if I don't answer it fully, just dive in, but we've got some dedicated stuff on that. So what this has all meant is, if we think about what the holy grail of security has always been, and we've talked about it for decades, is how do we get security truly at the board level of any company? And we've always said security is not a cost on the business, and everyone says, yeah, it is, sorry. So it's really been always hard to really engage. So what we've seen is a transition where now we've got these maximum fines of 4% of your parent company's global revenue. So just remind you, GDPR maximum fine is your parent company, 4% of their total revenue of the year. So it can be quite a lot. So what we've seen is a transition of the data protection officer suddenly becoming like the darling of the board. They'll respect me, but like poor CISOs over here, like, security, don't worry about it. I care about data protection now. Like, it's suddenly some massively different thing. We're all on the same side. We're just trying to protect people's data. It's just, I've got a 4% number in the back of my mind, and you're just looking for budget for a firewall. So, the question is, should GDPR matter to any of you in this room, or anyone at all, really? Now, the key point, the key point is that researchers, you all, are not exempt from the GDPR. And you'd like to be, especially some people by the door over there. But it's just the way it is. We are all in scope of it. And I hear lots of different justifications about why you shouldn't have to comply. So the first one is the I am the law kind of approach of, but I'm righteous. I'm helping the police. I'm taking down things. I had it when I interviewed New World Hackers a few years ago where they said, we DDoS the BBC to help them with their security. You know that line every single time. And then a few weeks later it was, we DDoSed HSBC to help them with their security. And then, so I was interviewing them for a podcast and then said, how's it going? I've just heard the FBI are after us. Yeah, I'm cancelling the podcast. And they sort of disbanded after that when they realized it got a bit serious. So, the point is, however righteous you think you are still in scope of having to comply with this. And a great example is the Crown Prosecution Service. So the people in the UK that actually prosecute for the government all as bad people. They just got fined by the regulator £325,000 for losing an unencrypted DVD. So we've got the regulator fining the Crown Prosecution Service. Like, they are the law. They don't care. They're just doing it. They're fining people. So, yeah, you doing good doesn't matter. Okay. Now, the other thing is about flying, under the radar. I'm too small. Anyone tell what film this is? Yes. Good call. What are their names? Yeah, is it Doug Masters? Anyway, so the idea is, people say I'm too small, doesn't matter, it doesn't affect me, I'll fly under the radar, you won't spot me. Well, yeah, you're probably right, but the issue is, the regulator might not notice you're doing something bad, or don't really care, and have a complete disregard of data, but they're not the people for you to be worried about. It's your clients, it's your suppliers, it's your business partners. I was just talking with Scott over by the door, and he was saying to me that his a big focus for him was having to justify to all of the people he works with, all these big corporates, hey, I'm on the same level playing field as you when it comes to caring about data. If you're working in a pen test company, you might have, let's say, 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people. But if you're going into a massive corporation like a aerospace company, they've got their standard of data protection. They've just spent $5 billion complying with GDPR. And you walk in and go, yeah, I've not got a privacy policy, or I'll get back to you on that. They expect you all to be as committed to this as they are. And that's how you can differentiate yourself. Going in and saying, yeah, I comply, here's our statement, here's how you do this, here's how you do that, here's our document. It's all done, it's already bang done. That shows credibility. That's the way you can benefit from the GDPR. And some people in this room, I know, have actually done that and have seen GDPR as a differentiator for sure. So let's talk about some fun stuff. We've been a bit white hat here, so let's go on to the black side of things. So let's have some fun with what you can do with GDPR. So I don't recommend you do a lot of these things because they're kind of unlawful or just being annoying. Now the first thing to say is access requests are now free. So previously you could go to any data controller like a university, like I mentioned in the middle, and say, you have some data on me, or the police, you have some data on me, please give me a copy. And they charge you £10 for it. Now it's free. So, now what that means, in theory, you could write a bot that just goes and asks everyone in the world for everything they've got on random people. Now, what people should do as data protection officers is make sure that the only data you give out to people is first of all verified and identified and authenticated they are who they say they are. Now, where I go and I work, I make sure we do that properly. Will everyone do that properly? If you email GoDaddy and say, yeah, I'm John Smith, I changed my email address, I've not got access to my old one, here's my new one, can I have access to my data? They'll probably be pretty good about it and probably make sure you're properly authenticated. Will everybody? So, and bear in mind, they have to give you this data for free within 30 days. We now have the ability to commit fraud on a massive scale. We can start capturing data on a truly epic scale. And I've not seen anyone do it. I've not seen anyone talk about it yet, but there's no reason why it can't be done. And the other thing to say about access requests is a company has to accept an access request on any channel. So if you email privacy at or legal at, as long as they actually see it, they pretty much have to accept it. even potentially a tweet, you could ask for your data. So yeah, just be aware of that one if you want to have some little fun on that. I know a few out there that aren't in this room have tried some of this stuff. Other thing you can also do if you just want to be a pain, just one sec, is just to ask for it on paper. Sorry, I've not got a good enough computer. I've got a tiny screen. Paper would be great, mate. Could you just post it to me? Yeah. Well, that's the thing. How many call centers have you ever rung in your life? They all record them, so you could ask for them. Maybe you wouldn't like it in audio. Maybe you'd like it in a transcript. So, I'll come back to you in a second, mate. But now, let's start playing this out in a kind of fun experiment. Remember the whole issue with PCI, where people were recording credit card numbers on call center phone calls? That's personal data. So if you want to see if a call center is recording and transcribed and kept your credit card numbers, just go and ask them for the transcript, because they have to give it to you. Now play this out even further. If a company is holding your password in clear text or encrypted, that is personal data that you have rights over. So you could say to, I don't know, British Gas, I'd like all my data and my passwords, please, because I want to use my password because it's so good, I want to use it somewhere else. In theory, they'd have to give you the password and thereby indicate whether storing your password in clear text or encrypted as opposed to hashed. So it's a very clear and probably simple way to find out how people are storing your passwords. So, yeah. Yeah. So an employee, the question was, do employees have the same rights? Employees are just like anyone else. As an employee, you can go to your company and say, HR person, please give me access to my records, potentially to references, that have been given about you, or there's some exemptions around things like negotiations for salary, like why you didn't get that bonus. But if you've left a company, that's when you want to use it even more. Why did I get fired? What went on? There's some real creative stuff you can do with this. And hopefully some of your cogs are all turning your head of like, how could you start having a bit of fun with these kind of things?
The FOIA exemptions still apply.
The what, sorry?
The FOIA exemptions still apply.
Yeah, so the Freedom of Information Act is a kind of sister to this. So Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, is all about non-personal data. So people still have to fully comply with that if they already do so. It's just that personal data would be a GDPR access request, non would be a FOIA one. Sorry, it was a...
Oh, you kind of answered it.
Great.
I was going to ask if, there's any recommendation how to verify people.
Yeah, this is a superb question. So how do you verify the person that's coming to you? Well, I would always say, try and do it within the channel you've already got. So if you've got a login-based system, let's say your Facebook, we just say, well, I trust them inside their authenticated session, so put it inside that. I wouldn't suggest Facebook have a phone line, because if you call in there, how are they going to start doing that? It gets difficult when you have a service where you don't authenticate to it, because what you can't do is start asking people for identification that you don't need. So here's an example. Facebook say, okay, to delete your account, I want your passport. Well, why? What are you going to do with it? And secondly, why do you need it? So you can't ask for more information than you need.
What about with Facebook? Oh, sorry, someone else.
And you go for it. It's more polite, but that's fine.
So like with Facebook, so if they're storing data about you and you don't have an account with them,
yeah. So
how would you answer requesting?
Yeah. So this is very pertinent. I've seen this in real life actually. So the question was, how do you handle access requests from organisations that you may not even know they've got it, and two, aren't inside, let's say, an account system. So is it shadow profiles? Sometimes they're called, where people are storing information on you. So as soon as you log in, register, they now add it all, and you've got all this context. For those, and Facebook ads are a good example of that. They've got detail on you. You'd have to contact them separately. So find an email address. Most people aren't set up for that. But the problem is, how do they authenticate you? Generally inside an email address. So bear that in mind. Most people are trying to authenticate you based on the email address they're tracking you on. So if you can spoof that email address, or spoof it with a domain name that looks very similar, like an I and an L, like Gmail, A-double-I or something, then they're going to not notice. The people you're talking to work in a call center, they're not security staff, they're not the data protection officer. They will slip up. And if they slip up, that's a really bad slip up. That's a clear breach of GDPR. So I'm not suggesting you do this maliciously, but there's a lot of potential for failure.
So in terms of terms and conditions?
Yes.
So when you sign up to a company to do whatever, whether it's an Apple or whatever it might be, and you might have dealt with this in the first 5 minutes, which I apologise for. So the terms, I'm so polite, I really apologise. Okay, so the terms and conditions that you sign up for might say, you send a request for us for that data, but it's got to be by post, by snail mail.
Yeah, so the question was, can you limit how you accept an access request? They've taken a lot of those limitations away. So you can't say it has to be by post, it has to be on this specific form. You could say, no, I'm doing it by this way.
So if they do, they're breaking GDPR?
Potentially. So there's a lot of reasons, like, here's an example. If you go to Facebook and say, I want to phone you and ask for my data, they could argue the safest, appropriate security way of giving you your data is via authenticated session. Someone else might say to you, well, we're the NHS, we need so much detail, we need it on this form because it gets OCR scanned and that's how we process it, we can't accept email. So there may be justifications. So just bear that in mind, but yeah, we'll see.
The validating a data subject access request is things that organizations just not thought about. They just said, well, we'll do the subject access request and we'll do it this way. It's like, but hold on a second, how are you going to actually prove that the person who's asking for that information is the right person, is that person? It's a big loophole in the whole thing that organizations haven't thought about.
And when in the medical industry, you have the issue of how do you, can you ask for information for your partner, your children, your relative? What if they're deceased? How do you change your name? It gets difficult. Was there a question at the back? Yep. Yeah, so I'm going to park that for a good reason. So the question was, how far can you go when inside a contract with a client to do red teaming and pen testing and stuff? I've got a few slides on that because it gets very dangerous. Now, one of the interesting things about the GDPR is it doesn't contain criminal offences, whereas the Data Protection Act does. And two of them that you should all be very aware of is an obvious one. Let's say we've seen examples where a nurse in the NHS took a load of admissions data and sold it to someone outside to go and do like ambulance chasing. That's a criminal offence. But also the Facebook issue where they took some data legally but then sold it on. That's also a criminal offence as well. So be very careful about data brokering and moving data around, passing around dumps of stuff. Be very, very careful with. And the second one is if you try to re-identify anonymous data or data that's basically been purposely anonymized. Now, there's lots of data sets out there that people generate, like the NHS might create some research data for you all to look at. But if you get the NHS anonymized data and then stick it along with the data set you've got from somewhere else and de-anonymize those people, that is a criminal offence. So if you plan to do anything like that or get anywhere near it, you need to contact the ICO and say, look, here's the reason why I'm going to do it, I've been asked to do it, I want to do it, or I've accidentally done it, or something around that. Get them involved first. The last thing you want to do is, jump into that scenario because that is something that has clearly been spelled out to be aware of. So contacting the ICO is an interesting one. I'm personally a massive fan of what they are and what they do and how they do it. There's not many government entities that you can go and do a live web chat with and get advice on. They are one of them. So they are very, very good. They do have their flaws in terms of the amount of people they have and resources, but you've got to play it safe. And that's a good example. Or don't go anywhere near it. If you think... I mean, the fact that's been added explicitly as a new thing for Data Protection Act 2018 suggests the government are really, really concerned about this. So just be very aware. Yeah.
Is there any argument you could make for the re-identification of the identified personal data? The fact that the data was insufficiently de-identified, or the fact that you looked at it and you used a publicly available data set, like walking down the road, you went, that person's in that data set, that person's in that data set. Because the data set said, person who walks down the road every Monday at 10 a.m. and wears a blue shirt.
So the question is really about how anonymous can data be, and if it's not truly anonymous, can it therefore be de-identified? Now, what is anonymous data? If you had to give you a personal data set that's got name, email address, phone number, whatever, and you anonymize it, it can be really difficult to anonymize data. It's actually incredibly difficult to anonymize data because there's still trails of data that you can de-identify people with. Now, if I give you a list of information that just says like car make and that's it, then that is truly anonymous. But if I say to you, if I title it Acacia Avenue cars, you could identify it straight away. So the concept of what is truly anonymous is a bit kind of blurry, but just general advice is just be very, very, very careful. And if you think you're going near there, speak to a data protection officer. Because,
it's kind of one good example of how hard it is to, so GDPR just says pseudo-anonymization, not anonymization, which is a little bit different. But the greatest example of that is when Netflix did their test of providing pseudo-anonymized data, and some guys in Austria actually broke it and re-identified everybody. It's really, really hard to do.
So where anonymization affects kind of everyone is if I say to a company, erase my data and erase my account, well, how do you actually erase data in a massive database architecture? A lot of it will break if you actually erase it. So what most people are doing now is just creating like an anonymization script that goes along and scrubs all the data and replaces it with other stuff. But you have to be very, very careful when you're doing that. So the big question probably you're thinking is about open source stuff. So what's already public information, what's already out there? And the general thing I hear about, well, it's public, it's fair game, isn't it? Well, the Information Commissioner herself, Elizabeth Denham, said recently, public data is not fair game. Just because you've put your name and address or your Twitter handle online, it doesn't change the fact that it's personal data and they have rights over it. Nothing changes. If you work for a company and they've got name and address there, nothing changes. It's in a contract, nothing changes. So what that means, if you're trying to, let's say an organization says to you, I want you to phish our employees against their company email address. Okay, go and do that. They then say, can you also go and do it to their personal email addresses? Here they are, or go and find them. Suddenly you have an issue where you as a tester are looking at them personally and invading their privacy in a way that the person would never expect. Now, there's certain kind of, where this gets even more blurry is something like LinkedIn, where if you go on LinkedIn and message somebody, well, you and they have joined LinkedIn and signed up to the T's and C's and say, I expect to be messaged by people. It's a messaging platform. So you kind of expect that. But if you put on Twitter, I like the Labour Party, and then someone phones you up the next day and say, hi, you'd like to join the Labour Party. Well, did you expect that? Did you expect it to be used like that? You've got to bring it back to its lawful basis, consent, contract, all these kind of things of what's fair and what's reasonable and what's expected. But don't assume that just because it's online, it's fair game, because it absolutely isn't. You've got to be very, very careful. So we can bring this back to employees as well. So if you find something on an employee that is a bit of a surprise, then just be very aware that that is not necessarily what they want you to be looking at. So, is it fair? Just because an employer has said to you, oh no, here, it's alright, it's an open red team thing, just go and attack and do whatever you want. The issue is, as a tester, you are a data controller. You decide how data is used. Although the company has engaged you to do the testing, you are a data controller as a tester. All consultants are data controllers. And what that means is you are responsible. So if you go and invade someone's privacy and look at their junk, then you've got the issue that they didn't expect that. The company might have said, yeah, it's fine, go and do that. But did they have the right to do that? Companies don't have the right to say to people, go and invade their personal space. They can't do that. So yeah, just be very careful that your statement of work might say one thing, but it doesn't mean it's in any way lawful. Any doubts, go and talk to your client, go and talk to their data protection officer and say, I've got a feeling that we can't do this. You know, you can't even give me a sign-off because I know there's no legal way I can do that kind of work. It's just invasive. Yeah.
So, something that I'm worried about in the future, especially going forward, is on engagements we might plan on some workstation. The company's told us we're using personal information, please don't go to personal folder. So we stay clear of that. But I might, as part of my engagement that we've done this morning, examine the history or the URLs that they're visiting in the browser. Now, a lot of them will be work-related, might be related to my target. A lot of them might be personal. I might see them booking a holiday, doing this, that, and the other. Now, I've collected that data just by viewing it from my CCTV action. What can I like?
Yeah, so essentially, if you now are touching personal data that you're thinking like, am I even allowed to touch this? I mean, a simple example you're talking now is if I just give you a database like a dump from a breach. What am I meant to do with this? Am I allowed to use it? You have to kind of consider your lawful basis and say, do I have a contract in place? Yes, I do. Well, if you've got a contract in place that says exactly what you must do, then you've got a lot of leeway there. But you've got to look at it on a case-by-case basis. But the simple thing is, be very, very tied to your contract and what you're meant to be doing. It's a lot easier when you've been contracted than when you just do stuff off your own bat, like harvest the internet for cool stuff on the dark web or whatever.
So I've got a million questions, but I'll just pick the one.
Yeah, great.
So, I mean, let's look at things like Have a Big Home, right? They have a database of usernames and passwords, and passwords is PII, so what's going on there? Like,
So it's a little bit strange with that one because Troy's view of have I been pwned about whether they have to comply with GDPR is that they don't have to comply because they don't focus on the EU data. They just happen to collect it. Now, if we kind of park that one, because I've got my own kind of perspective on that, essentially, if you collect data on people, one of the things you have to kind of bear in mind is these two articles, 13 and 14 of the GDPR, and these are really relevant to this scenario. What they say is, if I collect data from you, I have to tell you what I'm going to do with it. A privacy notice, or privacy policy, you all know what that is. But if I collect data of you without you knowing, let's say someone over there gives me your data. If I'm holding your data, how do you know who to contact to exercise your rights? You do not have any rights if you don't know who's got your data. So Article 14 is a really interesting one for all of you because it says, if you collect data on people, you've probably got to let them know. So the great thing, though, inside the GDPR is we have a little get out of jail free card that says if it's impossible, let's say because you haven't got contact details on them, or it's a disproportionate effort. So let's say you give me the, is it Turkish data breach? I've got like a big zip file with like 13 million people in it. It's too much work for me to do. But if my business is emailing people about breaches and I've got an email server that can send out 1 million emails an hour, I probably haven't got that argument for disproportionate effort like in the Troy example. Also, if you're a private investigator, well, hey, you know, it would hurt your job if you actually let them know you were surveilling them. So, other big thing is Whois. You're all aware that Whois is virtually dead. So, what's going on here is we're seeing, I mean, this is a search for my domain name, carlgottlieb.com. I've not paid for anonymity, but now I've got it because of GDPR. And what's going on is we have this battle between the organisation that manages all the kind of the domain name system, the registrars, and the European Data Protection Board. Now, and what's gone on is the Data Protection Board have said, you don't have a right to collect all this data anymore. And the registrars saying, like, we don't really... I'm going to caveat it, don't worry. What's going on is the registrars don't really care what's going on. The registrars are only going to lose out of this issue because of they're not selling private stuff anymore. But the registrars don't really care. The registrars basically do not want to get sued and do not want to end up in prison. They're worried about this. So it's easy for them to say, do you know what, Whois, we'll just kill it. We're just not going to process Whois anymore. And the European Data Protection Board, they've basically said, the case that I kind of coming up with about how Whois should be done isn't fair, isn't legal, isn't lawful. So there's this battle going on, and where it stands at the moment is the EU and these organisations have basically turned it off. in time, it probably will be turned back on in places, but law enforcement access things like that. So we're seeing a big focus on how you should be touching some of this stuff on the internet. Just because you find things like, let's say with Showdown, if you get access to a crematorium control system, these are real examples. The old two-factor authentication, how do you share a single thing? Or what was that, an elementary school heating system? Just because you find it, you have to look after it. What I don't end up in a situation is that you all think, oh yeah, I've got personal data and I'm just sort of like the blind leading the blind. It's not something you want to be messing around with. Be very careful. The statement of work is your friend. The contract is your best friend. When you're working with a client, how long do you retain that data for? You know, if you did a red team exercise, what happens after you've given them that report? Do you delete it a day later? A week later? You've got to define that because you're a data controller and you have no legal right to hold that data longer than you need it. So, you know, be incredibly careful. And especially if you're going to share that data. This is where it gets really dangerous. Because you have this thing of like, I've just found a SQL injection. Shall I contact the press? Or should I contact them? You know, what is responsible disclosure? Now, responsible disclosure gets interesting because we can now use extortion and say, I found an SQLI. I could go to the ICO, but how about we talk about this offline and see some brown envelopes with cash in? So just be incredibly careful with that. And one of the big problems is who do you contact? So my advice would be, if you find anything, email these groups of people, look in the privacy policy, and look for /security.txt. Not many people will have that. I'm encouraging people to do that for sure. But the privacy policy now legally has to state the contact details of the DPO. So, you know, please look at that. But a real scenario I talked with recently was, what if you get no response? And many of you in the room will think, which of these do you do? Do you contact the press if you can't get hold of someone? Do you keep emailing them? Do you speak to a regulator? Well, my advice generally would be to have some kind of email template that you use. This is an example one. It essentially just says, I found something, can we talk? But be aware there's been examples, real ones recently, where people have sent their notifications got stuck in spam filters because they had their PGP keys in the email. They had snippets of code. Email filters flagged it, and there's no way of knowing your email got picked up by a spam filter. So I wouldn't put that in. Open up with an introduction, get their notice, then get talking. You don't need to give too much information. Most DPOs like me don't care. We're mostly fairly simple people. So just get our attention, then get talking. So, I mean, the general summary is don't break your back trying to do any of this stuff. So, if I could summarize everything for you today, it would be, please look after data for both your own company's sake, your sake, legal sake, and fair morality, ethical stakes, the data subjects themselves. And if you're going to share it, be incredibly careful and get advice, because going to the press, tweeting about it, just dropping it, can be a very, very dangerous scenario. So, if you'd like to know more, then I have a podcast that has the amazing review of Spot On and Useful Without Being Boring. You can contact me all day. Please dive in, ask me questions, and thank you very much.